then the question will be, how is that done? And I think that's where we are all challenged. Our professional societies may opine on particular things. We may march. I suspect many of you were at the March for Science. And we may write. But whether we can reach is hard to know. This is a piece I had in the New England Journal in March. My co-authors, Tom Burke, Head of Research and Development in the Obama administration, Bernie Goldstein, former dean of the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health, had the same position in the Reagan administration. Okay? And we wrote here about the need to stay with the science. One quote, "Scientific evidence does not change when the administration changes." Certainly the handling of it may, as many of you know, or perhaps we all know, but generating strong scientific evidence is something we all need to continue doing. Assuring it's communicated properly we need to do. And standing up and assuring that it is treated the way it should be is also something we need to do. You may or may, who knows who Philip K. Dick is? So he's a science fiction writer who, among other things, wrote what became Blade Runner. If you don't know, he's some of the many little pithy things, but strange how paranoia can link up with reality now and then. And you know, if you start getting a little paranoid, you know, just think about where some of the drive for belief, the current stance on evidence might come from. How many stakeholders are having their interests affected by scientific evidence? So is this manufactured? Why? Are there players? Is there a deep conspiracy? I'm not a conspiracy theorist necessarily, but I think given what we've seen in the past with doubt, I think we should pay some attention to what's going on and its origins. So implications for us, for those of us who do epidemiology, is the death of evidence universal? Is it an epidemic? Might be. What are the implications of the dismissal of scientific evidence by the US for epidemiologists? Are there global forces? And what can we do to preserve the use of epidemiological evidence for advancing public health? I think our science is particularly vulnerable. I think it's particularly vulnerable for its power, for the issues that we touch on, and for sometimes its vulnerability to attacks, for claims of uncertainty, failing to adjust for the nth confounder, perhaps not using the latest marginal structural model or whatever else may be coming along. I don't know, we'll have to tell. Perhaps those tools will help us strengthen our case and being able to better tell the story about what it is we've learned. So are we at high risk? And I think the answer has to be clearly yes, we probably are. So I'm going to give you a few reading assignments, just so you know there are things out there. There was a useful workshop that had many players at the National Academies in March. The workshop proceedings is available online. This would be a great primer, examining the mistrust of science. It's probably 12, 15 pages, so a worthy read. And there's an unreadable URL at the bottom, but I think you've got enough for Google to help you out. And there it is. And then just a large number of books, and this is only a few. For some reason, I've become a completionist on reading all these books. The message is getting a little repetitive and sometimes depressing, but I think we need to know the story if we want to assure that epidemiology continues to be important. So I'd like to end. I think we have a little bit of time left. Again, I want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak with friends and colleagues. And if we do have time, Oscar, for discussion, let's do it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sure. You're a pro at this. I'll allow you to take your questions.
Never done this before.
Unmonitored.
Hi, I'm Ann Vandersloot from the University of Washington. And as I heard your talk, I just happened to pick up maybe a month or so ago The People's History of the United States, again by Hampton, and I hadn't read it in a long time. And it just reminded me that whenever the people in power are threatened, they tell lies. And it's, you know, if you watch the history of the justification of slavery in this country, or the position of women, or the terrorism of indigenous peoples, it was always done through lies that looked like science and truth. And it's carried on, perpetuated. So I'll have to say just a little thing that I went to the inauguration this year with my daughters, and we stood we knelt, I guess, on the ground with our backs to the podium as Trump was being, inaugurated. And my daughter stood up and said, "Mom, this is the death of the patriarchy." I don't know, there's this paradox in that it's always been this way. We all do have to work to stand up to it. This time may not be any different, but maybe we know more about how it all works, and maybe we're able more effectively to speak truth to power through what we're going through now.
So it's been a long time since I read that book. As a comment, and I said this is not about Trump at the start, because it's playing out perhaps in a most open and fierce way with this administration, but this change and this view of evidence and expertise antedates administration. And I think that's important, and it's not just top down, and now we have sort of bottoms up. And I think that makes for fertile ground for whatever top down may do. So I appreciate your comments, but I think we have to think of something that unfortunately is now multi-level and has a base with belief of many people. I think it's in the back. College from Michigan.
So, my very, very first public health class, I was an undergraduate at Hopkins, and it was 1994. And the chair of epidemiology walked in the room, and I think this was our first big public health class that we offered at the undergraduate campus. And he asked the whole room, what's epidemiology? And I stumbled into public health. I'd actually never heard. I came pre-med and I was undone. And he said, what's epidemiology? And somebody raised their hand and said, the study of the skin. Reluctantly, right? Mm-hmm. And then you said, well, maybe that would be epidermiology, but we sort of have dermatology, so. But you asked how many people think that, whatever, like half the room raised their hand, half of us were sort of half cocked. And it was you. You were my first public health professor. And I'm not calling you Bernie Sanders, but the one thing I love about Bernie Sanders, if you look at Bernie Sanders and who he was and the things he spoke about, you know, in the 70s, like, he's growing, but who he is fundamentally and at his core has been very constant and consistent. You always knew who he was. And it is so beyond awesome to hear you now, like, in a sort of in your own evolution. I mean, you were the chair of Epi, which makes you like a demigod for the students at Hopkins. But I'm just so like honored and moved. I'm back here like telling everybody, that was my first public health professor. So just on behalf of all of the students and all of the graduate students and all of the junior faculty that you've made just such a profound difference for, I couldn't be more honored to like acknowledge you as the guy who sparked the flame for me and many others.
That's really nice. I will say, I'm sure I'm speaking for Noel when I say this, probably one of the most gratifying things when you get senior, if you will, in your career is seeing all the people you've trained and how much they've accomplished. So Tiffany's here, and I will say that I'm delighted to hear your remarks. I'm glad there was somebody there listening. Thanks, Robin.
So my question is around developing better collaborations with basic science, the bench scientists, animal studies and cell-based studies, and really working more as teams in terms of really trying to elucidate the inner workings of the black box. and what you think about
Yeah,
that.
so I'll comment. I mean, clearly there are questions that are demanding in the evidence that needs to be mounted to answer them. The evidence may come from observations on people, observations on chemicals within people, DNA, gene activation, so many things. And I think that it's better for all disciplines of science if, when we approach a problem, we can tell a story together. I will say, and I'll point to Tyler and his colleagues, one thing we really need are tools that allow us to bring these different lines of evidence together and to join them. And I have to say, I've been on committees going back 30 years where, for example, we talked about using Bayesian methods to bring together the laboratory and the population. And 30 years later, I'm still saying we need better methods to bring together the laboratory and the population. But I hope the kind of work you and others are doing will help us achieve that. I think it's a key issue. Yes.
So fabulous lecture. Thank you very much for that. And this is a totally global phenomenon. This is UK-wide. This has been a big problem. And I was interested in your rallying fight back. And I was trying to think, one of the things that's been possibly the most successful in the scientific fight back in the UK has been to put science as a percentage of the economy, because that's all we talk about, obviously, in the Brexit era. And the other is to say how good we are at it, and wouldn't it be terrible if we were less good at it, so we're cutting edge. So the kind of writing which the public can understand are those two things, which is to say, my goodness, we're at the cutting edge of science and we should be proud of it. This is amazing, we're really good at it. We're good at putting multi-groups, teams from different groups of science together and coming up with solutions. So there's been quite a bit of writing about that, and the other has been about the economy, which is to say, what would happen if all our wonderful scientists left? What would we be left with? So those two arguments kind of play into the narrative that's happening in the UK now, and they really hit opinion formers who are not scientists. So one of the things we always think about in the public's health at RSPH is about getting people on side who are not the usual suspects and who are not in our territory and camp. And using some of those ways of doing it has been kind of how I think the response has been from the scientific community in the UK.
So I think a quick comment, and then I think we're done. And of course, you're right. We need many strategies. I was briefly at the career session before this, and I was gratified to see so many young people, so many sort of first timers here at the session. That said, I think we do need to do a better job of telling our story to those who need to hear it. And epidemiologists may be particularly poor storytellers. We use big words. We use words like confounding. I mean, really. You walk up to somebody in the public and said, "What's a confounder?" Forget about what's epidemiology. I mean, what are they going to say? So I think we need to tell our story better publicly and to the decision makers. And of course, the work we do has enormous economic implications, which I think is why, in fact, there's often so much pushback. Food, tobacco, air pollution. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I don't think there's been enough systematic discussion about what to do. Perhaps your society, others, this one really needs to take the lead. But I can see time is up.
Actually, I
Thank you so
have
much.
one.
Well, I just have one follow-up to that, because I teach health equity students, and so they're students who are really passionate about, and they want to, be activists, and they're across the School of Public Health, so they're in all disciplines. And, when you're talking about fighting back and how do we train them, what's the next step with them? So, they want to write op-eds, they want to, do things on social media. How can we, provide those opportunities for them inside the academy, or is it, telling them to fight for policy? What direction should I be taking them in?
If I had hours, we could organize a meeting. But I do think, talking to ourselves, that is not enough. And I think, I'll leave it at that. We need to think about what are the channels to reach out. It's like the paper I had in the New England Journal. All my friends wrote and said, well, great paper. That's exactly what I would have said. Do I think Scott Pruitt read it? I doubt it. I mean, maybe it was in, EPA attacked in the daily bulletin, but I do think this is something we exactly what you said, to help all of us really do a better job of reaching out. And again, I think this should be part of what schools of public health need to figure out as sort of another metric of the impact that we should be having.
Thank you, Dr. Samet. Thank you all. This concludes our Career Awards session. We do invite you to our social hour. We know you're competing with tons of other social hours, but we have a special one, and you will get an opportunity to spend some time with our awardees as well. I will ask our awardees, please come up to the front so we can take some group shots with the leadership of the section. And once again, thank you all for your due diligence and for being with us this evening.